Tuesday, June 5th, 2012. The Free Syrian Army, or the Syrian rebels, that had just captured the Sunni Muslim town that lies in the foothills of the coastal mountains that form Assad's heartland, and they quickly became witness to various attempts at taking the town, and they weren't shy of confronting it or attacking them. They became the target of one of the most notorious armies and regimes in the entire Middle East, and after shaking up the hornet's nest one too many times, the town was ambushed by the Syrian army, but not before they were prepared to fight. 5 tanks, 5 armored personnel carriers, and 20 soldiers later, the Syrian army were fighting for their lives. To begin our exploration of the Syrian conflict, it is important to understand the various factions and interests at play. At the center of the conflict is the Syrian government, led by President Bashar al-Assad, which has received support from Russia and Iran. In opposition to the government are a range of rebel groups, including the Free Syrian Army, which has been backed by the United States and other Western nations. It is worth noting that these rebel groups are not a unified force, and there are many different factions with varying ideologies and goals. Some of these rebel groups have been accused of committing human rights abuses and using tactics similar to those of the government, adding to the complexity of the conflict. In addition to the government and rebel groups, there are also various factions with vested interests in the conflict, including Kurdish groups, religious minorities, and terrorist organizations, all of which have played a role in shaping the ongoing conflict and have contributed to its complexity. The Kurdish groups, particularly the Syrian Democratic Forces, have emerged as key players in the Syrian conflict, largely due to their efforts to fight against the Islamic State. The Kurdish groups, who are predominantly located in the north and east of the country, have established a degree of autonomy in these areas and have been successful in driving out the Islamic State with the support of the United States and other Western nations. However, the Kurdish groups have also been in conflict with the Turkish government, which views them as a threat to its national security due to their ties to the Kurdish Workers' Party, a designated terrorist organization in Turkey. This has led to tensions between the Turkish government and the Kurdish groups, and has further complicated the Syrian conflict. In addition to the Turkish government, the Kurdish groups have also faced opposition from other factions in the conflict, including the Syrian government and rebel groups, which have sought to undermine the efforts to maintain their control over the territory. The Kurdish groups have therefore found themselves caught in the middle of a complex, multifaceted conflict with various factions vying for power and influence in the region. The Syrian conflict has also seen the involvement of various religious minorities. Each of these has its own distinct interests and motivations. Among these groups, Christians and Shia Muslims have largely supported the Syrian government, while Sunni Muslims have largely supported the rebels. This dynamic has been shaped by a variety of factors, including the sectarian divide between Shia and Sunni Muslims, as well as the historical relationship between these groups and the Syrian government. For example, Christians and Shia Muslims have traditionally been a minority in Syria and have often seen the government as a protectorate of these interests. In contrast, Sunni Muslims, who make it up the majority of the population, have sometimes felt marginalized by the government and have therefore been more likely to support the rebels. However, it is worth noting that these religious groups are not monolithic, and there are many different factions within each of these groups, each with its own distinct agendas and goals. This adds to the complexity of the Syrian conflict, as these religious minorities have often found themselves at odds with one another, even as they are all impacted by the ongoing violence and instability in the country.
One needs to be towed. Some get cannibalized for their heavy caliber machine guns and ammunition. Rebels also have rocket launchers, though it's impossible to know how many, captured from the regime or smuggled in by supporters. Here, large caches of ordnance in rebel hands, also captured or smuggled. The U.S. only admits to sending in communications gear.
Our goal is to try to do what we can to try to assist them in a way that can make them more...
As the Syrian conflict has continued to escalate, it has attracted the involvement of various outside powers, each with its own agendas and interests. One of the key players in this conflict has been Russia, which has been a key ally of the Syrian government and has provided military support and diplomatic backing to its president Bashar al-Assad. Russia has been instrumental in helping the Syrian government regain control over much of the country and has its influence at the United Nations to block efforts to hold the government accountable for its actions. In contrast to Russia, the United States has supported the rebels and has conducted airstrikes against the Syrian government and terrorist groups with the goal of overthrowing the Assad regime and establishing a more democratic government. However, the United States has faced criticism for its intervention in the conflict and has its efforts to support the rebels often been overshadowed by the involvement of other outside powers, such as Russia and Iran. In addition to Russia and the United States, other countries such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia have also been involved in the Syrian conflict, often with their own agendas and interests. These outside powers have added another layer of complexity to the conflict, as they have sought to shape the outcome of the conflict in their own favor, often at the expense of the local population. I'm actually excited to bring on a special guest on today's episode, Jill Geyer, the communications director at United Way. United Way is a local refugee help center that assists individuals and families affected by the Syrian conflict. They provide a range of services including housing assistance, legal aid, language classes, and support for job training and employment. United Way supports Syrian refugees in a number of ways. They provide housing assistance to those who have been displaced as well as legal aid to help them navigate the process of seeking asylum in their host countries. They also offer language classes to help refugees integrate into their new communities and support job training and employment to help them become self-sufficient. If you want to help out United Way, you can get involved by making a financial contribution, or you can volunteer and give them your time and skills to help refugees in need. It is impossible to overstate the devastating impact the Syrian conflict has had on the country and the region. Over the course of the conflict, millions of Syrians have been displaced either within the country or abroad, as they have fled the violence and instability. Many of these displaced people have ended up in overcrowded and underfunded refugee camps, where they have struggled to access basic necessities such as food, water, and medical care. The conflict has also seen widespread destruction and loss of life, with the hundreds of thousands of people killed and entire cities and towns left in ruins. The humanitarian crisis in Syria has been further exacerbated by the ongoing blockade of certain areas by various parties to the conflict, which has made it difficult for aid organizations to access those in need. In addition to the impact on Syria itself, the conflict has also contributed to the ongoing refugee crisis in Europe and the Middle East, as many Syrians have sought to flee the country and find safety elsewhere. This has put a strain on the resources and infrastructure of the host countries and has fueled tensions between different groups as they compete for scarce resources. The Syrian conflict has therefore had a ripple effect impacting not only just the country itself, but also has had an impact on the wider region and beyond. It is a crisis that has touched the lives of millions of people and has a lasting effect and impact on the region. As we have discussed, the Syrian conflict is a complex, multifaceted issue with a variety of factions and outside powers involved. It is a conflict that has been shaped by a range of factors including the sectarian tensions, regional rivalries, and competing interests. The involvement of various factions and outside powers has not only served to further complicate issues with each group seeking to advance its own agendas and interests, but has also made it difficult to find a resolution to the conflict. And despite the various attempts at peace negotiations, the conflict has continued to escalate with no end in sight. Given the complexity and severity of the Syrian conflict, it is clear to say that there is no easy solution. However, it is important that we seek to continue ways to address the crisis and mitigate the impact of the Syrian people and the wider regions of this impact. We hope that our discussion today has helped shed some light on the complexities of the conflict and has provided a better understanding of the various factions and interests involved. conflict. In the next episode, we're going to be discussing the current state of the Syrian conflict by updating you on any lasting developments in the conflict, any potential resolutions or ongoing challenges with the conflict, and finally, any lasting impacts of the Syrian conflict and its potential repercussions for the region and the world.